The presence of anxiety is proof that they work perfectly. It's not only okay, it's actually necessary and reassuring to see it there.
Dr Lisa Damour is a clinical psychologist and author who specialises in education and childhood development.
Psychologist and CBS News contributor Lisa Damour joins us right now.
She's the author of not one, not two, but three best-selling books on teenagers and adolescent mental health.
She was also the psychology consultant for Inside Out 2, the highest-grossing animated movie of all time.
Hello! I'm anxiety. Where can I put my stuff?
A new emotion.
I've presented to the entire crew about adolescent development. They just really wanted to tell a true story about teenagers and emotion.
I'm Lorraine Candy, best-selling parenting author and mum of 4 children, and I know the questions which keep parents up at night. In this series, I'm going to be taking the panic out of parenting by getting practical advice from experts on how to navigate the complex journey of raising teens. In this episode, we're going to be talking about teenage mental health.
Teens are experiencing a mental health crisis. 42% of high school students reported feeling persistent sadness or hopelessness in the latest data.
74% of teens report having more than one symptom of stress.
I'd experienced an anxiety attack while out with my family or in English class, and I didn't know what to do because I didn't have any guidance at that very moment. I could be completely still, and inside my body would be racing.
I overthink everything I say to other people. And that causes me so much stress because I'm like, oh my God, am I annoying? Am I weird? What do they think of me?
I just always feel like I'm drowning. It's like there is always some kind of darkness in my head.
Yeah.
So, given these rising rates of depression and anxiety, should we be worried?
I wanted to have a chat at the beginning about the huge success of Inside Out 2. It's the biggest film of 2024, and you were a consultant on that, the biggest animated film. Tell us how you contributed and what you brought to the film.
Getting to work on Inside Out 2 was as fun as anything I've ever done professionally. What happened was that in May of 2020, I got a call from Kelsey Mann, the director, and Meg LaFave, the writer, that they wanted to meet. So we hopped on a Zoom. This was early pandemic. And they were holding my book Untangled, and they were holding my book Under Pressure. The first about typical development in adolescent girls, the second about stress and anxiety in girls. And they were already deep into my work and wanted to keep talking. And so that began a 4-year conversation where I went back and forth to Pixar sometimes. I saw drafts of the film and gave feedback on it, made suggestions. They did make some changes based on some of my thoughts. And I also, at one point, spent an hour with the entire team just talking about typical development in adolescence. I cannot say enough about Pixar's devotion to the science and to getting it right, and to really taking very, very seriously the incredible platform they have to shape the discourse around adolescence and also around emotions.
Yes, well, it was really striking to watch. I've seen it twice now. You brought in anxiety, envy, embarrassment, and ennui, which is kind of disdain, which is a classic teenage emotion. Tell me why, from a neurological point of view, that happens at 13, because Riley, the protagonist of the film, is 13, and 13 is when it all starts.
So one of the things that we have long observed about adolescence is that there's a neurological watershed around age 13 or 14, where the brain suddenly becomes quite a bit more sophisticated, much more capable, faster and more powerful in new ways. And with that comes the ability to take another person's perspective in a whole new way. So it's not that kids can't do that before 13 or 14, but that becomes suddenly a very, very developed capacity. And so with that comes the capacity for self-conscious emotions. So anxiety is like imagining, well, what could possibly go wrong? Embarrassment is imagining, what do people think of me? Envy is, why does that kid have something I want? And of course, ennui is, you know what, I'm over all of this.
Which is a thing I found as a surprise, actually, as a parent. I'm over all this, and I'm particularly, mum, over you. And it's a real separation, isn't it? Because what Riley is doing is forming a sense of self, and it's this new sense of self which begins to play out, isn't it, in their brains?
Absolutely. And one of the earliest conversations that I had with Kelsey and Meg, and that continued throughout our work together, was around her sense of self and around perfectionism, which becomes a key, component of the film. And that is something we see in adolescents, and it's certainly something we see in adolescent girls, where they sometimes struggle with accepting their own shortcomings, accepting that being human means having flaws. And so I love how, in addition to telling a story about emotion and bringing across how complex and wonderful and necessary even unwanted emotions are, the film also tells a story about coming to a place of self acceptance and coming to a place of recognizing shortcomings while still holding oneself at a reasonable level of self regard.
How do we contribute to that sense of perfectionism as parents? Do we sometimes apply too much downward pressure to achieve? Are we putting the emphasis in the wrong area?
I think we have a hand in it, even in the most well meaning ways. So there's a couple of places where I can see this at work. One is I am watching parents to get more and more anxious about how their kids are faring through adolescence. And I don't know exactly what this is about, but I suspect it has to do with broader worries about the future.
Yeah.
And so I think when kids are feeling anxious and parents are feeling anxious about what's ahead or where everything's going, they can start to become very, very preoccupied with the data right in front of them. How did you do on that test today? Why am I getting this call from your teacher? And so we can have a very strong reaction to what, Lorraine, you and I know are the typical and expectable bumps of adolescence. So I think that's one component. Another component is that loving, well meaning parents sometimes actively celebrate perfection, right? So a kid brings home 100
Yeah.
on a test, and the parent goes, "That's amazing, great job." And sure, that's great. It probably means the test was too easy for the kid. But what we risk in those moments is giving kids, and I will say especially girls, the impression that that's the expectation. And one of the pieces of work that I have done over time, especially in my work around adolescent girls, is to help them become more tactical and strategic about their approach to school, which
Mhm.
often means helping the parents and caregivers support a more tactical and strategic approach to school, rather than polishing everything to a high shine, making decisions about when it's important to give everything its, full force of activity and effort, and when it's okay to sort of back off a little bit, cruise, take it easier.
Yeah. It's celebrating the effort, isn't it? In a way. Now, you do talk about anxiety. You're particularly knowledgeable on this, and I know this has become such a terrifying word for many parents, because there is a difference between anxiety, being anxious, being clinically diagnosed as suffering with anxiety. Can we just talk quickly a little bit about anxiety? Because one of the great things in your books is that it's okay to be anxious, it's okay to be sad, and it's okay as a parent to see those feelings play out and rather than fixing them. How do we do that as a parent? Why is it okay for us to see our children in an anxious place?
Well, I'll take it even further. It's not only okay, it's usually proof of mental health. And one of the places we're getting hung up right now is that too often people are equating being mentally healthy with feeling good. And so when they or their kids don't feel good, they worry that they're looking at a mental health problem. But if your kid's best friend moves away, your kid is supposed to be sad. And if your kid's not sad, that's actually more concerning. If your kid has a huge test coming and they have not started studying, they should be anxious. The presence of anxiety is proof that they work perfectly. It's not only okay, it's actually necessary and reassuring to see it there. Uncomfortable emotions are enormously valuable. We've done a bad job as psychologists in that we use the term anxiety to talk about healthy, everyday anxiety, and we use the term anxiety to also talk about disorders. And so I think that has not helped the understanding of the situation. But it's important for us to recognize anxiety can be healthy and it can be unhealthy. And one of the achievements I think of Inside Out too is that the character of anxiety really covers all of that ground in the course of the film. There are times where she is exactly on point. She is warning Riley of things that are amiss. This happens early in the film, this happens late in the film. And there are also times in the film where she spins out of control. And one thing I got to see happen in the arc of working on the film is that she as a character became quite a bit more adorable over time. In the early iterations, she was sort of villainous. She looked like this like harsh businesswoman with a briefcase. And then as she, evolved, she's, adorable. She's annoying, but she's adorable. And I think that that actually captures the very dual nature of anxiety, that it's there to help and sometimes it's a little bit too much.
We can welcome its presence sometimes as almost adorable. Now, one of the things that is very anxious making for both parents and teenagers is this what I call this awful year nine. It's year nine here, I guess middle school in the States, this when they hit 13 frenemies thing. The toxic friendship groups, the changing friendship groups. It's every parent you speak to whose child has just gone into year nine will have a WhatsApp stream of messages about terrible things that have happened to their boys and their girls. You know, I'm on my fourth teenage. I've been through my children being, left alone and ostracized, made the odd one out, made fun of for what they're wearing, had whole groups told not to talk to them that day, not to sit with them on the bus. I mean, it's really heartbreaking as a parent. Explain to me what is going on and why we all go through this, because I don't know anyone who avoids it.
Um, it's the worst. In the US,
The
that's eighth
worst.
grade, so 13-year-olds. And I will say in the US, seventh and eighth grade are consistently the years that nobody would ever have to, if they had to do it again, they would refuse. I mean, nobody wants to go
Exactly.
back after that. So there is a lot at work. One of the things that is universal is that kids are loosening their ties at home in the course of normal development, and so then strengthening their ties to their peers. But to mix metaphors, there's a juncture where they're sort of between the shores. They have loosened things at home and they will soon swim their way to very secure, more, young adult relationships. But in the in between, they are very anxious about who they're connected to, very worried that they won't have connection. And so then a lot of behavior that we'd really rather not see can crop up. Kids securing relationships by boxing another kid out, kids agreeing to be part of friendship groups with kids they don't even like. That happens a lot. Friendship groups, including kids who have a lot of discord within the group itself. And so that causes what we would say is a lot of drama. Um, Lorraine, I'll tell you one of my favorite findings, and this remains as true as it's ever been. The happiest kids have one or two good friends, and they fly really low socially, and they have really steady and reliable peer groups that are very, very tiny. These kids themselves often feel sort of marginal or uncool, but when we look at overall stress levels, the
Mm.
fewer kids you are trying to maintain ongoing strong connections with, the better off. And I will tell you, this feels way more intense in terms of the discord in the wake of the pandemic. I think two things
Yeah.
happened in the pandemic. One is kids lost a lot of good old atmospheric pressure about how to behave socially. They lost it because they weren't in school. And the other is that I think because of just overall heightened anxiety in the wake of the pandemic, kids are more anxious about who they're going to be friends with, wanting to be more sort of tight grip on their friendships, and then as a
Yeah.
function of that, sort of behaving in bad ways to keep those friendships going.
It does feel a very cruel part of their childhood, doesn't it? These early teenage years where certainly from my experience, girls really do like to punish each other sometimes. It feels like they access really unpleasant emotions, which they're testing out. Is there a difference between boys and girls on the cruelty and the punishment? What have you noticed when you've talked to families who've gone through this with boys and girls? Is there a gender difference?
So there is, but it's not in the direction people think. So the reputation is that girls are meaner than boys, and hence we have the term mean girls. This is not untrue that girls can be very mean, but when we look at the data, what we see is that girls engage in what we call social aggression, relational aggression, which involves excluding, spreading rumors, or weaponizing relationships. Boys are more likely to engage in physical aggression, but it turns out boys are, by some measures, just as likely, and by other measures, even more likely than girls to also engage in relational aggression. So this isn't great. Like, this isn't a race anybody wants to win. Like, which gender is meaner? But when we look at the data, in terms of like frequency of unkindness, boys routinely outpace girls. Now, it gets to the question of like, well, why doesn't it look like that? Why do we have this sense that girls are so much less kind than boys? And we think some of that may have to do with how girls respond to unkindness. So, girls as a group, and again, these are broad gender generalizations, so take them for what they're worth. When they are upset, they're more likely to discuss it, to seek somebody out to talk about it with. Boys as a group, when they're upset, are more likely to distract themselves, to try to find a way to get the feeling to wear off without telling anybody about it. So, the upshot of this is a single mean event among girls will spread very widely. A lot of people are going to hear about
Yeah,
it.
ripple.
A lot of how here eighth grade boys are, year nine boys where you are, a lot of how they do their banter is actually quite cruel. And it's a
Yeah.
very delicate and tricky situation for kids on the receiving end because it's just a joke and supposed to be funny. But I hear from a lot of schools and boys' schools that it's all really funny until somebody gets really hurt and hauls off and hits somebody. And that is not an infrequent occurrence.
Mm-mm. Is it also a little bit that we as a society don't teach girls how to deal with anger or how to be assertive? Because it is hard to get that message across. And we also, therefore, don't teach boys how to recognize their feelings and talk about their feelings, because, as you say, they'll distract from their feelings. Could we lead into it in the preteen era a bit easy, make it more easy if we start teaching girls about being assertive and boys about talking about their feelings?
I think there's a lot of work to do. I'm all for doing it. I think for girls, and this is something I've written about quite a bit in my book, Under Pressure, it is really helpful to teach them how to do conflict well. I think because we don't teach them how to do conflict well, either they act like what I call doormats, they just let people mistreat them, or they act like what I call doormat with spikes, which is they use passive aggressive techniques to manage their distress. What we really want is to use the metaphor I like is for girls to be like a pillar, standing up for themselves while being respectful of the other person. But that takes training, that takes time, that takes talking about the fact that maybe their impulse is to be a bulldozer, which is to run people over. Maybe their impulse is to be a doormat or a doormat with spikes. But those metaphors work well. Kids catch on to them very quickly. One observation that became clear to me as I was working on the emotional lives of teenagers, my most recent book, is that we have to be very thoughtful about who is doing the work of trying to get boys to talk more about their feelings. Because what we see in two-parent heterosexual homes is that the person who's most likely to be talking about feelings or trying to talk
It's
about feelings
mum.
with her son is his mother, right? And the problem
The
is
female
by,
caregiver for him.
exactly, by 10 or 11, a lot of boys decide feelings are for girls. And then if they have a mom and a dad and their mom is the only one talking about feelings, this well-meaning mother may actually be entrenching exactly what she is
Yeah.
trying to undo. And so Lorraine, the work here falls to men. What we need is that for the men in boys' lives to become much more active in talking about their own emotions in front of boys and then asking boys about their feelings. I I'm not saying a mom can't make it work well for a boy, but I am saying this should not be treated as women's work, which is what has happened until now.
Question I get asked a lot by the mums is, when does it turn from mean, unkind, unpleasant, cruel behaviour into bullying, serious bullying? What are the differences there that we should be looking out, listening out for from our children?
I'm glad you're asking because this is an area where psychologists are actually pretty precise in the definitions. And it's important to have precision because how we respond to conflict between kids and how we respond to bullying between kids actually looks very different. So, the way we understand it is that conflict is kids not getting along. And that's just a part of life in schools. I think about conflict as like the common cold, right? We can't get rid of it. If you're around other people, you're going to have it. It's just natural to being human. Bullying, and I think of this being more like pneumonia, serious and more rare, is when a child is being targeted by a peer or a group of peers repeatedly and is unable to defend themselves. And that happens where a kid is on the receiving end of ongoing mistreatment and they are helpless in the face of it. Now, the reason it's important to make this distinction is that how we help kids with conflict often involves getting the kids together and helping them have it out in a healthy way. We do not do this with bullying. If we think bullying is at work, it does not involve getting the kids together. That can backfire and make things quite a bit worse. It does instead involve things like the school working very carefully to look into the situation, collect information, figure out what's really happening. If there is bullying at work, make sure that appropriate consequences are made available to the bully, or seated, worked out with the bully, and that the kid who's the victim is very well protected through all of this.
Yeah, so it's important we know the difference as parents. Now, we all go through this then. We're sending our kids off to our teenagers off to school and our preteens. What, if we talk about advice, the specifics that we can do around them, what are we saying to our young people when they come back and they say to us, this is happening to me? I've been frozen out all week. Everyone's laughing at what I'm wearing. All the girls have been told not to talk to me. I mean, these are situations I've been through with mine, and lots of mums have told me about. Do we send our girls back in and say, no, stand up for yourself, be tough?
No functioning adult engages everybody who hurts them or bothers them. If we think about it as adults, when someone is unkind to us or rude to us or we don't like them, it's pretty rare that we take it up with them directly. I think about how many people in work settings have colleagues they truly dislike, but if they see that colleague in the workroom or in the elevator, they'll be like, hello, how were your holidays, right? We'll sort of make a choice to
Yeah.
take the path of least resistance. I think we need to allow that possibility for girls. And sometimes I wonder in an exuberant feminism, and I'm all, I'm a dyed-in-the-wool feminist, we've sometimes urged girls into conflicts that no adult in the same situation would engage if they were in it. So I think the first question I always ask when kids come to me with complaints about how they are being treated, after giving lots of empathy, I will say, do you want to do something about this? And it's not that rare that a teenager will say to me, "Oh, no, I don't even like these kids. I don't want to be friends with them." So they've been on the receiving end of mistreatment, but they don't need to repair it. They have no interest in trying to fix it. So I always start there. Sometimes kids will say, "Yeah, I thought we were really good friends, and I need to understand what's happening." Under those conditions, I'll coach them to use a model of healthy conflict, to bring up the concern, but not in an attacking way. At other times, I will say to kids, for the sake of your own dignity, do you need to say something regardless of how this unfolds? And some kids will say yes. But I worry that we have reflexively, in a loving and protective way, sometimes said to girls, you need to go tell her that wasn't kind. You need to let her know where you stand. And the girl is thinking, I've known this kid for years. This will not go well. And we haven't always made space for that knowledge base in kids.
Yeah, and I think that's often the surprise as well with parents going through it the first time. You think, hold on, these are children we've known for years and we've been around them for ages. So that's often a shock, isn't it? That you might have a girl or a boy ostracizing or being unkind to a friend they've been really close to for quite a long time. That's not unusual, is it?
It happens. And I think it's shocking when it occurs. I think adults try to get their bearings. I think often in trying to get their bearings, they reach out to other adults. I can tell you, as someone who has lived in the same small community for a very long time, I wish adults didn't do that so much.
Yes.
Um, it is, true that kids can be real jerks at points in development. I will also tell you, I've watched those same kids go on to just be awesome, high school students, fantastic, 16, 17, 18-year-olds. They had a rough patch at 12 and 13 where they were really unkind. But I worry that sometimes when adults are feeling anxious or very shocked by that behavior, they feel like they, didn't see it coming from that kid. They will get on WhatsApp and start talking about that kid with other families, sometimes throwing around labels like bully or mean girl. And those are hard labels to shake. So I want us to be really careful about how we talk about other people's kids. And it's really hard when another person's kid has hurt your kid. But I also want us to bear in mind any one of our kids could turn around and hurt somebody's kid. And we would want that parent or caregiver to be pretty discreet in terms of who they felt needed to know about it.
Yeah, because sometimes you have to welcome those children into your home knowing what you've been told, but also knowing what you've been told is an interpretation, may or may not be true. It's very complicated, isn't it?
It is. And, I've been in this position as a parent. I watched a kid. I was there. I actually witnessed it. Saw a child be mean to my child. My child was badly hurt. I will never forgive that child. They're all old now. It
Oh,
was too painful. But I've also never spoken about her to anybody besides my husband.
exactly. There is something I read recently about the reaction of your child or preteen or teen in those situations. Some children freeze. And then the other reaction is the fawn. There's the freeze or the fawn. Some children try very hard to be back in that. The pull of the popular is, and then put themselves in situations where they might be taking risks to please that popular, the fawning element. Tell us a bit about those two reactions that your child may go through in that situation.
So when a child is mean, what they are doing is they're exercising tremendous social power because not everybody's willing to be mean. Most kids actually are not. And so at the moment when a kid makes it clear that they will be cruel, suddenly a huge amount of social power comes to them because the kids who become aware of this or who witness this are now thinking, I don't want to be the next one. I don't want to be on the receiving end of this. I need to stay safe. And I think it probably plays to some very core evolutionarily driven understanding of safety. And so what you described, the freeze reaction of like, okay, that kid can be mean. I'm gonna just be real quiet so as not to put a target on my back. Or the fawn reaction of that kid can be mean. I want to be on their team so as not to be a potential target. And so the longer I've worked in this space, Lorraine, the more I have really come to view this all in a very Serengeti way. That these are kids who need to have a pack that they belong to, need to feel a part of things. I think the sense of being cut from the pack has a life or death sort of intensity to
Mm.
adolescence. And so we then see what seem like very primitive ways to try to actually maintain group membership and not be the next one who is pushed out.
And how do we talk to our young people about it then? Well, actually, do we talk or do we just listen?
I think we start with listening. And I think we also start with a whole lot of humility. When I imagine a lunchroom of 13-year-olds, I imagine the social dynamics that are flying around that room are occurring in like 40 dimensions. I think kids may be able to perceive 25 of those dimensions. I think adults can perceive one or two if we're lucky. So I think listening is really powerful and important because frankly, we don't know that much, and our advice is likely to be bad because we just cannot understand the sheer complexity of what kids are up against. So giving kids a way just to talk about it, unload it, get past it just by explaining it, going back in the next day to deal with what comes is not a small thing that we offer our
Yeah.
kids. So I think we do that. I think the other thing we can do, I think it's helpful sometimes to have backup friendship groups. I Both of my daughters have gone to summer camp in Colorado, which is the state where I grew up in. Both of my daughters have ended up with text threads of the girls in their cabins who live in California and Colorado, and I live in Ohio. And both of them, at times when they were really, really frustrated with their peer group at school, would be back in touch with and get lots of love and
Yeah.
support from their friends from camp.
So we shouldn't be intervening. We shouldn't be talking to the other parents. We should be encouraging outer worlds outside of their school. But what if our teen or preteen is the mean girl or the unkind person in this mix? What's going on with them? Why are they doing it?
Well, Lorraine, I really think a lot of times they stumble into it by accident and then discover how effective it is. I
Yeah.
think sometimes kids will just try on being cruel, try it out. And this is, again, back to our conversation about Inside Out 2. They are 12 and 13. Their thinking is very concrete. What it reminds me of is this old New Yorker cartoon of like two congressmen walking up Capitol Hill in the US and, holding their briefcases. And one says to the other, "How do you know you have social power if you don't abuse it?" No, he says, "How do you know you have power if you don't abuse it?" And I think you could just substitute in social power for adolescents, especially
Mm.
young ones. And so I think sometimes they just experiment. Like, what happens if I do this? And then suddenly, everybody is nicer to them. Everybody wants to be their friend because they don't want to be a target. And it can be something that they are then off to the races and acting in ways that they shouldn't and that they're not going to feel good about over time. So, if you hear that your kid has been mean, my encouragement would be to not be defensive. It happens. It doesn't mean your child is a mean child. It doesn't mean you're a bad parent, but it does mean you need to have a really direct conversation with your child about how they treat people. I also think it goes a long way to let kids complain at home and to say at home what they wish they could say at school sometimes. It is very frustrating to be a student. It is very frustrating to be 12, 13, 14. You spend a lot of time with a lot of kids you don't like. You have to be civil and decent. And I think sometimes we can support kids in doing that by having home be a vault where they can speak very freely about how they really feel. I think that can support civil behavior during the school day.
And when should you talk to the school about it or the educate wherever they are? When do we say, right, okay, a line has been crossed?
Yeah. So I think if you suspect bullying, if you suspect that your child is being repeatedly targeted and unable to defend themselves, you should reach out. I It is my preference that the child be on board for that. I think sometimes parents will get very activated and reach out to the school,
Mm.
and then the child is suddenly in a meeting at school that they didn't know they were going to be in, didn't know the call was going, and maybe sincerely wishes the parent hadn't made that call or hadn't made it that day or made it so fast. So I think that there are times if it needs to happen, ideally the kid would be involved. And then I think you go to the school very humbly, right? Kids don't always tell the whole story. I have sat in this practice office on several occasions with kids who wanted to show me a text thread of how badly they were being treated. And they showed me the text thread, and I'm like, but wait, is this you right here? And they're saying really mean stuff too. And they're like, but look at what that kid said. And so I think
Yeah.
we want to be really humble that we may only be hearing part of the story. So I would encourage families not to approach the school in an attacking way, but instead to say, here is what I am hearing. What are you seeing? Can we begin a process of trying to figure out what is going on here?
I've got one final question, which I think is you can tell us the answer to this. What do you think Inside Out 3 should be about?
Ooh, ooh. I would love for Riley to be a mom. I would love for her to have a son. I would love to explore his inner world.
That's the next thing, isn't it? Yeah.
That would be
Brilliant.
my insight.
Oh, thank you so much, Lisa. You've been so helpful. As usual, so many things parents can write down, go away, and immediately put into action. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Always a pleasure to be with you, Lorraine.